Aloha mai kākou. Welcome to the 23rd installment of the Ke'o Center for Sustainable Island Food Systems Brown Bag Speaker Series. Thank you all for joining us today for this timely conversation. Today's session focuses on what recent storm impacts have revealed about Hawaii's farms, food systems, infrastructure, and community response capacity, and what it will take to move beyond short-term reaction towards stronger long-term resilience. Before we begin, I want to extend a special mahalo to our panelists for taking the time to join us today. We really appreciate their willingness to share their perspectives, experiences, and all their expertise across food systems coordination, farmer advocacy, and disaster recovery. My name is Ioane, and today's conversation is really about helping us think more clearly and collectively about what these recent Kona Low storms have exposed, not only in terms of immediate losses, but also in terms of the deeper strengths, gaps, and opportunities within Hawaii's food and agriculture systems. Please scan the QR code on the current slide to access the center's website. I'll also be dropping relevant links into the chat, in the Zoom chat throughout today's session, and we'll have a recording of today's webinar that'll be shared through our MailChimp newsletter following the event, along with some key highlights and information about upcoming brown bags. If you're not already subscribed to our newsletter, don't worry, I'll be sharing a link to that in the chat as well. So a little bit about the center. Ke'o Center for Sustainable Island Food Systems is an initiative at the University of Hawaii System, co-directed by Dr. Albie Miles and Dr. Noah Lincoln. Our mission is to uplift food system transformation statewide by supporting food security, ecological sustainability, education, policy, cross-sector collaboration, and community partnerships. In some of our broader work, the Ke'o Center also engages in applied research, policy analysis, community-based education and convenings, cross-sector partnerships linking academia and practitioners, and by convening voices from agriculture, policy, emergency response, and community, we seek to strengthen Hawaii's path toward greater food security, resilience, and systems change. Today's format's going to be a little different than many of our past brown bags. Rather than having each speaker give a separate presentation, today's event will take the form of a structured panel conversation. So I'll be guiding us through a set of questions designed to move across several key areas, including the impacts of the storms, shortcomings revealed in response, the recovery process and lessons learned, longer-term resilience building, and the planning and policy implications going forward. So, but as always, audience participation is encouraged and will take place through the Zoom Q&A feature. So please feel free to submit questions at any time during the conversation. Again, today's topic, from recovery to resilience, lessons from the Kona Low storms in Hawaii. I want to introduce today's panelists. We're honored to welcome three speakers whose perspectives help us look at this issue from complementary but deeply connected angles. We have Amanda Shaw, Statewide Food Systems Coordinator, Hawaii Department of Agriculture, David Lopez, State Disaster Recovery Coordinator at the Governor's Office of Recovery and Resilience, and Hunter Heaivilin, Advocacy Director at Hawaiʻi Farmers Union United. So with that, we'll begin the conversation here. Let me see. We'll give this opportunity for you guys to introduce yourselves real quick if you'd like. Start with you, Amanda.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Amanda Shaw. Actually Statewide Food System Coordinator through Agriculture Stewardship Hawaiʻi. We have a public-private partnership with the state of Hawaii. So that's how that goes. I'll pass it to Hunter.
Thanks. As said, I'm the Advocacy Director with Hawaiʻi Farmers Union and also an agricultural planner with a background in disaster management.
Yeah, I'm David Lopez. Apologies if my camera's not working, but I am the State Disaster Recovery Coordinator and try and look at putting the state back together after we have some of these disasters. And we also have a resiliency aspect, and which is, of course, trying to make it so that these disasters don't affect us as much as they could. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, thank you all again for joining us. So our opening question is for all panelists, and I think we can just keep that order for the all panelist questions. We'll go Amanda, Hunter, and David. The first question is, what were the main food and agriculture impacts of the Kona Low storms, and what do we know so far about the scale of losses?
Thanks, Ioane. Yeah, I mean, just want to say, first and foremost, like information is still emergent, so we're still getting reports of impact. I'll let Hunter say a bit about the reporting tool that we've collaborated on, kind of the update there in terms of like the numbers and how much money folks are estimating that the damage caused them. But really, when we look at it, if we're thinking about the food system as a whole, so everything from production to consumption, these storms really impacted all of that, from, the food that people consume in terms of getting access to that for households, but, really disrupting every aspect of people and farmers' lives in the areas that were hardest hit, and even beyond the areas that were hard hit. I think some of the things that have emerged in terms of those impacts really have to do with language and community relationships, relationships to government, how much folks feel that they can, trust working with government agencies, official agencies, technology access. Yeah, it really impacts, what we know so far about the storms. So again, information is still emerging from some communities that aren't English language speakers and have other challenges.
Thank you. Hunter?
Yeah, I think building off of that, the short answer being, this isn't just an isolated set of farm losses. There are multiple production areas, both geographically and kind of within the production system, that were affected, creating sort of a layering of impacts across crops, fencing, roads, water systems, equipment processing, all the way down to kind of household stability. From our statewide disaster impact assessment tool, as of about 2 minutes ago, we've got over 500 responses and covering about 4,000 acres and roughly 31 million in reported damages. This is self-reported data, and does require some additional deduplication, because we have been letting folks know if they had submitted once, they can submit again if they've got updated estimates. But this, despite those caveats, it provides decision makers a much faster and more grounded picture that previous assessments didn't really afford. And so this tool really grew out of efforts in the wake of the Maui fires. And I had partnered with a similar effort, and produced a survey that, again, similar to this one, routes information to farm membership organizations so they can better assist the impacted operations, and then was also used by Farmers Union to help route grant resources to impacted operations. So part of what it really affords is, giving us a ground truth quickly, and that enabled us to go pursue advocacy, as well as keeping us from just guessing about the scale and distribution of losses. And of course, I'm not clever enough to come up with this on my own. This is really informed by, in part, what other states have done, not necessarily US states, but particularly a couple of Australian states that have moved to set up at the regional level standing dashboards and survey intake systems to assess agricultural disasters. And so gleaning from those processes, we designed this as a mechanism to demonstrate what could be possible here. It was a demonstration tool until about a month ago, and we decided to make it live, and I think it has demonstrated to be quite helpful.
Awesome. Grateful for all the work you're doing building that tool out. David?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with the other panelists about this, and especially about emerging costs. And so our office is especially concerned about that, and getting into other things with that cost, like soil remediation, future crop loss, as well as looking at contamination sites and things like that. We've noticed too with the increase of electric cars that leads to lithium battery problems and things like that. So seeing things like that and understanding the costs around that for recovery. And then I think another piece on the resilience side is looking at, just in general, the affected communities and understanding things like food delivery under exigent circumstances and understanding how better to plan for isolated community type events is a big learning point that, again, we're trying to improve upon.
Thank you, David. Next question is for Hunter. Wondering which producers are having the hardest time accessing assistance right now and why?
Yeah, I would say, I think the producers who don't fit neatly into formal disaster systems, these are smaller, diversified farms, maybe farmers with insecure tenure, leaseholders, lessees, those with licenses, versus even long-term leases, maybe producers without strong paperwork, whether that's about their farm or themselves. Those with limited language access, and certainly those that weren't already in relationship with USDA or maybe even the Department of Agriculture and Biosecurity at the state level. What the survey has I could say re-demonstrated is that the vast majority of operations do not carry insurance in the state. There are a handful of larger commodity sectors that do, and some of those are supported by federal insurance programs. But in a tally a few weeks back, while there is a micro farm or whole farm insurance program with USDA, I believe in 2025, one farm in the state participated in it. So as a result of these federal programs not being especially well tailored to local needs, we've got a lot of producers that are agricultural businesses that just don't have the kind of coverage that most agricultural operations do. But we also can see in terms of those having hard time accessing assistance that it's not just a distance problem, right? That even where community assistance centers exist, some producers are still not necessarily showing up there, which points to issues of trust, language, outreach, timing, and questions, I think, about the extent to which programs actually match farm operations. And this is at the state level.
Oh, we just lost Hunter. Okay. Well, I'll kick it over to you, Amanda. A question for you. Wondering what parts of the food system proved. Oh, Hunter, you're back.
Zoom needed to restart, apparently.
No worries.
What was I saying? So yeah, it's not just distance, it's timing, and I think points to the extent to which disaster assistance programs, be they philanthropic, state, or federal, are not tailored to farm operations in the islands, right? And in many cases, maybe differentiate between households, support for household versus support for business. So if we say, oh, that's your business, you're not eligible, but if your farm is also your household, where is that line? And if your farm is sustaining your household, as we have, many agriculturalists that are participating in subsistence production as well as commercial market activity, those lines get pretty blurry. So I think what it's afforded us is a better understanding of the extent to which building out a better program fit could in the future ideally ensure that there's fewer folks that aren't receiving access to the programs that are out there.
Thank you, Hunter. Amanda, what parts of the food system proved most fragile or interdependent in ways we didn't fully anticipate?
Thanks. Yeah, I'll kind of take the part. Maybe I hear the interdependent piece as kind of like actually a strength and an asset. So, I think Native Hawaiian and different immigrant like ecosystems and communities, rural residents, farmers and ranchers, like we saw those folks that had existing strong relationships mobilize and support their communities immediately, even when information was scarce. So just really like want to highlight how powerful those examples have been. And I think we've seen that over and over again in the disasters that have been faced, is that communities come out and where relationships are strong, that really is like the immediate response. And it is, I think, important to see that while we might all wish there were even more learning from previous disasters, there has been some, and there are relationships that have formed as a result of things that folks have gone through. So I think that was just, it continues to be like such a source of inspiration and important for us to like continue to support, is that community mobilization. I think the fragility, and again, I think part of what's happening, at least what I understand from folks that do a lot of this work, is that a lot of these disasters are about learning and relearning lessons that are out there. And so I think information again was incredibly fragile, kind of finding out what was happening. The communications pathways were incredibly fragile. Um, and just generally our formal response system felt incredibly fragile. I think we saw that in a number of ways. So our ability to monitor streams in real time, just I think one of the hard lessons that keeps being relearned is that fragility. And expecting that things are all figured out by someone somewhere is as a dangerous assumption. At the same time, I think there is a lot of incredible coordination that's, again, been happening and been building on lessons from previous disasters. And that coordination takes time, it takes resources, and we really do need to prioritize it.
Well, thank you, Amanda. Next question is for David. How can coordination between agencies, counties, farm organizations, and community networks be strengthened during recovery and for facing the next disasters?
Yeah, I think probably it would start with connecting with the government agencies and groups in the emergency management enterprise. So that would be people like in our office, HI-EMA, the city and county emergency management agencies. And of course, doing this outside of the emergency is best. Lay these foundations early, understand where you might fit into their system and who you contact to understand what happens in the emergency and what you can do to improve your position before the emergency. Within our I think within our government agencies, I think a big piece of this, Hunter alluded to this earlier, is about understanding the way emergency response works, especially in conjunction with the federal agencies and FEMA. And as he noted, that in general, the FEMA programs, which is what you get in response, aren't well tailored for the ag industry and our farming community. So understanding that what those programs might offer the farmer on the individual, or the people in the ag community on the individual or the business piece of that, and then knowing again how to be in touch with the people who provide those programs. And then for our government agencies, I think we need to really improve. Know what I said about the FEMA and the response, but then know what groups that we go to that provide some type of assistance to this community, and then be able to activate that assistance, which would be beyond what is normally considered, the FEMA response. And I think probably overall in doing this is trying to socialize the idea of more strategic way to look at not only the response and how we act, but also, the strategic look at like how do we improve infrastructure around these events. The Kona Lows really showed watershed issues, and so how do we do watershed remediation or mitigation on larger scales, and really take a look at that from a kind of a Mauka to Makai approach, because in general, principles across the state, we have the same problem. We might have some geographical nuances, but in general, we have the same problem of, higher elevations with rapid watersheds run through some, of course, agricultural lands, and that may have limited or reduction in agricultural use, which when you get right down to it, that's land management. So that means a greater amount of higher elevated lands that have not had good land management. We have overall plantation era or aging infrastructure. And looking at these things kind of more holistically within the watershed, and then of course all the agencies that would go to support improving that, I think has to really be considered, because at the end of the day, the last factor is that we have a greater population base that has filled the lower areas, and again has greater effect by the combination of these factors.
Oh, excellent. Thank you, David. Next question is for Hunter. What pre-disaster investments or practices do you think help reduce damage or speed recovery? Oh, you're still muted, Hunter.
Still?
There you go. Nope, you're good now. We missed the first part.
Okay. I think some of the most useful investments are those that can help farms and communities reconnect quickly after disruptions. This is the drainage, watershed work, having resilient water systems, passable roads, access routes, backup power, trusted communication networks, and knowing what not just a return to normalcy, but having a vision of what kind of building back better looks like. To me, as a planner, this sounds a lot like planning. I think also, I don't know how much we could say I don't think we could say it's reduced damage at all, but in terms of speeding recovery, I think at the system level, one of the most effective kind of preparedness investments was having this rapid assessment tool that has aided coordination and relationship building to facilitate that reconnection, or new connections in many cases. That same intake tool we use to capture urgent needs, sort of like triage needs, food, water, shelter, but also built the evidence base for funding and policy. The other side, I think, to David's point, right, is that the administrative readiness matters too, both at the extent to which emergency management agencies, to which the agricultural sector is legible to emergency management agencies and is integrated or not into their planning systems. I've participated in the Emergency Support Function 6 on mass care, which is food, water, and so forth for the past half decade or so. But the Emergency Support Function 11 on agriculture hasn't really had a robust presence as part of emergency response in the state. And as a result, we've really been trying to build out the infrastructure for what that could and should look like through civil society groups. And fortunately, through connections with folks like David, and I think Haima has been a little more in the discussion of late as well. I think we're building a more robust system so that these programs and efforts are legible to one another. So I've really kind of viewed that as part of my unappointed task of trying to play between the civil society groups and the formal response systems and translate between them where possible, which I think to some degree highlights that it's not just physical infrastructure, it's about shared information systems, relationships, and maybe even some of the nitty-gritty of procurement flexibility and clear coordination pathways so that the community response is able to integrate well into the formal systems and get the resources that they need and have some better understanding of where and how they can interact.
Thank you, Hunter. Next question is for all panelists. what specific changes in planning process or policy you think should be institutionalized at the state level? I can start with you, Amanda.
Yeah, thanks. I know there's lots of kind of specific things that folks have been learning, and maybe Hunter and David can speak to their views. But I guess from where I sit, I've been really inspired by the work that's happened around the Maui recovery. Something that I've heard recently from folks involved with that, including Kaea Medeiros, who's at the Department of OEV Resources, is just the importance of having a culturally led, community driven, and government supported response. And I thought that framework was really succinctly put and really speaks to the kind of need that I think we're seeing. That's grounded in Ike Hawaii and the places that are being affected, that it's community driven and reaches out to everybody who calls that place home and is informed by their needs, as we see in Lahaina, and that government is there to support really around that kind of prioritization and place-based groundedness. And the exciting thing is, I do think that as we're building these relationships, and some relationships have been longstanding, and I think this call is evidence of that longstanding interrelationship as well. But there are folks that are really, committed to doing this work inside government as well. So while, things are fragile, we know that folks are really interested to make those changes together and to find better ways to respond. I guess the other piece just to say is these disasters, especially I think this series of disasters showed us how differentiated and place specific, so it was happening in different places on one side of a street and not another, in one part of a valley but not another, and to certain communities more than others. So just really needing to have gender, race, disability, other forms of disaggregated understanding about who is being affected. We just still don't see enough of that because, I think that the systems aren't really set up to do that. But those are some points from my side, is just being able to understand that some folks are going to have a much harder time accessing government programs, for example, and that really is where philanthropic and other private resources need to be directed. Thanks.
Thank you, Amanda. Hunter?
I think there's three durable changes. So I think first, I would say institutionalizing this standing agricultural rapid assessment tool. I think we've got the contours of what that could look like. We're capturing immediate triage needs. We're capturing gross economic impacts. And some of the on the ground work in recent weeks has highlighted the need for something kind of in between the two, or what are the material needs for a farm operation as they start moving towards recovery. And we're really looking at how that kind of a collection system could also be an on-ramp into federal support through USDA, making sure that the questions asked there are pretty much the same questions that'll be asked on a variety of USDA applications, and pre-collecting as much as we can to make it more accessible. There are some open questions for how something like that gets operationalized, particularly because while the USDA, Farm Service Agency, NRCS, and others, mainly those two, will in many cases go into these farm assessments, they're not actually able to share that data with civil society partners who may be participating in a much broader scope of recovery and relief related activities. So that's part of the reason that we've situated the tool as it exists in civil society. Is if government collects the data, they can't necessarily share it with us. If we collect the data, we could share it with government. It's not currently structured that way. So if you've taken the survey, fear not, that's not where the data is going. But if it became integrated with funding and other tools that were coming from the federal side or from the state side, which has been a discussion with both county and state partners over the course of this, is if we are collecting the data and releasing some of the public funds, that data doesn't necessarily then live within government, but is still benefiting from government resources. So that would, I'd say, is kind of the first one. Second, we need to make sure we're designing programs around the actual shape of Hawaii agriculture. This is smaller, diversified, underinsured producers should not be treated as edge cases. DAB has a disaster loan program, but its own reports find that some 90% of farms in the islands are not financially viable. And if the only other option is a $1,500 grant, when we're looking at $31 million in damage, and otherwise saying we'll give you a low interest loan. Loans is not what most people are seeking when they've lost production across multiple regions and multiple production cycles, right? So it's the delay, it's the immediate harvest loss, the delay in future production, and outstanding questions of maybe you lost everything you'd already harvested because you don't have power. Maybe all of your goods that are products that are still in the ground might not be sellable because of food safety concerns. Maybe your markets are closed, right? That was the case, or disrupted, as was the case more so with the fires. So we need to just make sure that the programs that we're designing address the diversity of agriculture in the state. And I would say, with my admitted bias from the Farmers Union perspective, that we're focused on family farmers, which is to say the majority of farm operations in the islands, which are tend to be smallholders. Finally, I guess I'd say we got to treat the coordination capacity as a real infrastructure that requires investment. This is language access, community-based outreach, data sharing, rapid procurement pathways, and rapid mechanisms to distribute resources to producers as they're moving through the cycle from relief to recovery. And I guess on that recovery end, and the Gov's office had shared with us just this week, that the mental health aspects of this are critical as well. It's not that recovery is over when the debris is cleared. For producers who've lost additional production cycles and income, mental health is a key factor that needs to be better integrated into all of these response systems. And heartened to see that that's increasingly the case. So I think broadly then it's institutionalizing the tools and the relationships. And while it has been wonderful to be kind of integrated in all of these systems, it's not something that's actually part of a job description for myself or for Amanda. And so this critical infrastructure of moving between all of the civil society and the formal governance systems, I think, is a real form of infrastructure that also needs support going forward.
Thank you, Hunter. And David, specific changes in planning, process, or policy you think should be institutionalized at state level?
Well, I think probably be overarching to what both my counterparts have talked about, and it would tend to roll to kind of the overall philosophy that we have to work on. And I think that would be in 2 points: is to be more proactive in our approach to all of these things, and probably improve upon the way we plan. On the proactive approach, again, this is actually doing things that kind of solve these riddles, instead of just waiting for something to happen and then try to always be in the reaction mode to it. In the near term, we could work on things that I think Amanda was speaking to, some of the technology that helps us provide early warning, like stream gauges and things like that. And you develop action planning around some execution points. And this is, of course, in response. And the government can do this on their level, and the community can do this on their level too. And so, for instance, in this idea, if I live in an area where a stream is a threat and there's a stream gauge, I should understand what the rise in that stream means as a threat to my farming operation, my house, my home, what my ability to access my home or property, and so forth. And develop a plan on what I'm going to do to protect myself, or how I'm going to act at certain points when I feel I'm being early warned, in a sense, in one way or the other. The state emergency management and response teams have to do the same type thing and become, again, more proactive in understanding what what the early warning signals are and what type of action plans we're taking. Then in the long term, as I mentioned before, is the long-term strategic planning. And this happens to fit in kind of the mitigation recovery portion of it, is really start looking at being strategic thinkers about this and look at solving these issues from, a little bit more than just putting in a bigger drain or a an improved road in a certain place. Is that we have to take on a more holistic approach to our mitigation. Then when we speak about planning, anybody who's talked with me about these things before know that I'm very systems approach oriented. We get a better bang for our buck that way. So the more people we can incorporate into systematically looking at the issues of mitigation, response, and recovery, we have a better chance of building strategic plans around those things. And when we do that, then we should think in the terms again of our planning philosophy as being mutually supporting plans. So if we come up with a strategy, if we have a vulnerability that we're trying to improve upon and we're using a mitigation technique or plan to do that, once we're successful, we should see a change in our response plan. We should see a change in our recovery plan because we've made a significant mitigation improvement. And so this is the way we can measure if what we're doing is a success and kind of tie these things together. So those would be the two big changes if I was king for a day that I would incorporate to try to drive solutions to these issues.
Mahalo, David. Hunter, you talked a lot about what was maybe going on with the small producers falling through the cracks. From your perspective, like what you're hearing directly from farmers and ranchers, what impacts are still being overlooked or undercounted in the system?
I could say from just some questions that came up on a Farmers Union webinar about our grant program yesterday, Amanda was also a part of, I think highlighted two kind of key pieces is in a disaster assistance program, how is one supposed to attempt to quantify significant erosion? Right, so if you just had feet washed out from your fields, and maybe you've been practicing the best land management you can and investing in your soil for 10 years, how do you even begin to quantify that as a loss and an impact to your farm operation? Outside of the question of how do you begin to rectify that if you've now significantly lost a primary investment that isn't as material as a crop in the ground that you had a price point around. The converse of that, which is also very much an open and yet to be readily resolved question, is if you just got the multiple feet of soil that somebody else lost and it's now deposited on your farm, potentially with debris, rocks, trash, etc., what is the remediation process? And what pathways or decision-making pathways need to be understood as you determine, should I just scrape all this off? Is that my job? Is that something any government entity is able to help me with since I'm on private property, since I'm a business? And in some cases, we're talking feet of soil across acres of land. And so while the household cleanup was rapid and amazing to witness, up in Wailua and Haleiwa, just legions of support. But it's a lot harder. You're not going to pressure wash 15 acres of ground back into production. So I think those are a couple of the key kind of open questions among many.
Yeah, interesting. I hadn't thought of that. Thank you.
I wondered if I could
Ama-
say a little bit on that actually as
yeah.
well, because I think those are really, really important. And just like, I think a couple of other things, maybe three other things, kind of like the geographicness of this, the geography, kind of like that, I think is also about who's being overlooked and undercounted. So we just heard about some windward farmers. That for the first time we're kind of coming and getting connected with community because there were ongoing relationships of trust. So the Key Project, for example, just doing a really good job of supporting farmers in Windward Oahu, where those impacts have been less publicized. Waianae as well. There's a meeting on Saturday for folks affected in those communities. Ka'u on Hawaii Island as well. So just that I think it's easy and it is, what happened in Wailua and the North Shore, Haleiwa, throughout that area is obviously really, been a huge impact. And we see that in our report as well, but that there's these pockets, kind of like we were saying. And then I think it's also really important to keep in mind where farmers and farm workers, and even more broadly, food system workers were before all of this. If you take them as a whole, everybody that works in restaurants down to folks who grow our food, like those folks are already twice as likely as other workers to need food assistance. There's been information about mental health and suicide amongst farmers that's come out recently that's really concerning. So folks are already suffering from really challenging situations. And we know that disasters and trauma like make that worse. There's lots of concerns around mental health right now, around domestic violence and violence against children and within families, substance misuse, and then secondary trauma as well for like first responders. So just I think that can sort of get overlooked maybe as we focus in, sometimes as Hunter was saying earlier, I think, what is a farm? It kind of brings together often for many farmers, the home and the business or the livelihood. And so just if we're taking kind of a holistic view, we have to kind of remember where folks were at before this started.
Thank you, Amanda. Um, David, from the state perspective, when does the storm event like this, when does it shift from being considered response or recovery? When does it shift from response to recovery, rather?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and uh, sometimes that's a tough to discern. But in generally, what you're looking for is across the different. If those of you familiar with the emergency response system, is that you have emergency support functions that all have a certain focus, like critical infrastructure and energy, mass care, ESF6, Hunter alluded to before, medical, ESF8. So you have these different sectors that are built in these emergency support functions. As we see those sectors stabilize, meaning that they're starting to move, they have kind of achieved the necessary actions that have taken care of life and life safety and life saving. So you see a reduction in the actual, threat to people, and then you start seeing protective measures being put up to reduce any further threats. And as these conditions evolve, which is doesn't always happen fast. It might take a month, it might take 2 months in some of the sectors. But as these conditions evolve to more routine repair, then we start looking to say, okay, what what is this routine repair moving to, and what is the permanent fix that we need to do? And then we start considering to look at what it takes to move that sector into what we would call recovery. And then each emergency will, those are the basic principles. Each emergency, the conditions might vary a bit between each of the ESF sections based on the severity of how that ESF has to function because of what happened during the storm or the event. And so, and they might not all be at the same time. So you might have concurrent transition where you have ESF still operating, performing some type of, I guess you could say, emergency repair or stabilization, but the conditions are good enough where we can start moving to recovery and planning the long-term improved permanent fix of whatever we're working on within that sector. And then our recovery is set up similar to ESFs, but it's not a one-for-one change. So we have recovery support functions. And so you might have several ESFs that might make up or merge into a recovery support function. So for instance, we have a recovery support function for critical infrastructure, and that might combine probably about 4 or 5 ESFs. And so that recovery infrastructure RSF then takes on and looks at the issues that those ESFs were facing, and then moves them toward what will be the permanent fix, which may take several years. So our initial planning window from the day of the event is 5 years. So that kind of, it's probably difficult to understand, but that's kind of the conditions that we look at in trying to determine when do we look more at recovery versus response.
Thank you, David. And I have a question for all panelists. Speaking of recovery, we'll start with you, Amanda. What is the one concrete lesson from this recovery process you think should immediately change how Hawaii responds to the next event?
It's a hard one to think of one. I think I think we could probably list practical ones, but I think I'll go with really the one that's more relational, which just really is that. And I think everybody said it in different ways. That the relationships that different communities have with each other, that the relationships with those of us who play like supportive or service roles have, and that the folks have in government, and that really strengthening those is a huge priority for resources and time. Nobody can do everything, and so it's just so important to have that like heterogeneous, group, a mix of folks. So I think I would really just go, it's relationships, but I think again embedded within the right kind of framework. So I think, both everybody sort of talked a bit about like systems and multi-stakeholder and multi-sectoral groupings. And I just really think the highlight from Lahaina and elsewhere that folks have been putting that together in a place-based and culturally responsive way is just really critical, so that the relationships are founded in those principles. Yeah.
Thank you. Hunter?
Yeah, I guess I'd echo that. I think the relationships, or maybe to unhelpfully abstract it a bit, it's, that a lot of time and work goes into information flow, information management, and having those relationships in place and having systems and protocols so that information can move quickly to where it needs to, both from communities to government and vice versa. And within both of those, I think there are known issues across both, community level understandings and how a community, within a given community, there are or diversity of opinions as always, and even within the formal response systems within government. One request for assistance collection tool at one layer of government doesn't necessarily talk to another. And this is just basic, protocols that I think could be, well, I don't want to say basic, but protocols that could be pursued to ensure that there's just better connectivity and flow, and can reduce the amount of, swirl that occurs as information moves from one point to another. And ideally, that can hasten the distribution of resources for relief and for recovery. So I think that's part of what we've been working on, trying to develop through the survey tool, through some other on the ground tools, collecting info from farms at the, it's a particular geography, other tools we've developed for trying to understand, watershed scale issues, stream clearing, et cetera. And it's going to vary place by place, but yeah, I guess the information flow making what others are up to a little bit more legible.
Well, thank you, Hunter. And David, concrete lesson from the recovery process you think should immediately change how Hawaii responds to the next event?
Yeah, I think mine would be, and our office is already changing, would be around, like Hunter had talked about with the SF-11, the agricultural emergency support function, is try to make that more robust. And for us as an office, it really highlighted and reinforced the lesson that we have to really develop kind of these long-term strategies, understand what the vulnerabilities are, and then be able to know what we can reach to outside of FEMA, because as we've discussed in historically in response, is that's the first look as what does FEMA provide. And has been identified with this is that there's not a lot for our farming community and ag community around what FEMA offers for this. And so that was our really big lesson, to know that we have to get in front of this and then be able to access those programs very quickly, because in many cases, there's not very much time. You have a short application window to figure out what you want to do and apply for it. So in many cases, it's as tight as 60 days after the event occurs. And so we have to really get ahead of that and understand, based on the conditions of the event, who do we go to for help, and be able to push those buttons very quickly. And of course, that takes an education of everybody would help support do that. Yeah, so we got our work ahead of us, but yeah, I think that's our biggest lesson. Like I said, we're already making changes on how we do that.
Well, that's good to hear. Thank you, David. Another question for all panelists. A lot of folks watching, it's hard to know what to prepare for and where things like this are going to hit. And, just wondering what you think, things that folks out there can do now to strengthen preparedness before the next disruption. Let me start with you, Amanda.
Yeah, thanks. It is challenging, just reflecting the other evening when there was another earthquake warning that ended up not having a tsunami impact here in Hawaii. But, I think that those moments of like compounding natural disasters coming on each other's heels, we were seeing increasing numbers of those due to climate chaos. So I think Hunter's point about kind of like multi-hazard preparation. Now we've seen, given all the rain, there's a huge amount of greenery that's grown up. And so, as we move towards the summer, thinking about the fuel load that represents. So really having those lenses, those multiple hazard lenses, seems really important in the farm context. And so resourcing education and outreach and support for farmer to farmer knowledge exchange around like perhaps what was helpful in some areas, what kinds of practices across the landscape and on individual farms helped folks manage. And many of those, again, are based on historic knowledge and traditional agriculture and place-based work that's happening. So I think a multi-hazard lens on how to prepare would be something I know I'm really interested in seeing us resource.
Thank you, Amanda. Hunter?
I would echo the, I'll say longstanding interest of mine and work on trying to develop tools for, this is a jumbly sentence, multi-hazard, multi-stakeholder, agroecosystem-based disaster risk reduction. Just doesn't everybody want to sign up for that? But I think at a much more individually actionable level, I think a lot of the disaster management industry sector and scholarship really continues to highlight the importance of relationships, and that knowing your neighbors, knowing who is in your community, is just such a critical piece of response capacity, no matter the volume of resourcing within a given community. Of course, having more resources tends to make things easier, but even in the absence of that, tight-knit and well integrated, communities that are, maybe this is anchored by community organizations. I think in the case of ours, the presence of our North Shore chapter here on Oahu was really critical to having some rapid outreach, and as well as having the support of our state chapter and staff. But the individual opportunity to really just get out there and know who's in your neighborhood, know who are the farms down the street, and building that out is, while it may seem trite, if that phone tree needs to be activated, if it happens to already be in your Rolodex, you're better prepared, and it doesn't require maybe the more protracted efforts of hazard mitigation planning and how hazards optimization for one can increase risk for another and so forth, that I think is also critical. But for the individual action, need somebody new.
Awesome. I agree. Thank you, Hunter. And David, what do you think individual action can be to strengthen preparedness before the next disruption?
Yeah, I would say definitely all the things that have been mentioned already are great ideas, and I would say is be prepared to take part of your own rescue. Look at your home just the way I've been speaking, as in a systems approach, or whatever you're trying to protect. Think about, if you're living there, your food system. How do you take care of yourself in that respect? Power, fuel, wastewater, and so forth. Think about how you're vulnerable. Think about your capability to be without that particular system. How long can you last? And then prioritize what you want to respect to, what you want to protect or harden or respond to, and develop a implementation plan. Understand you're probably not going to get it done super fast, but start doing things to improve your position, and over time, then you're going to be in a much better place. But you have to start slowly, starting to try to improve your position, and taking advantage of the times when we're outside of the emergency to get ahead of when we will be in the emergency.
Thank you so much, David. Winding down on time now. So I just wanted to mahalo everybody again for showing up today. Thank you to our guests. Thank you so much. These folks are all so busy, working super hard to do this work. And just a final thought from me, I just, I look around in community when all these things happen, and I'm so grateful that we all live here, because everybody shows up in community, and the people on the ground start the first actions and get this stuff rolling. And I'm just so proud and happy to see the way everybody shows up for each other, and see how hard you guys are working to show up for us here and educate us on all these different things. So mahalo everybody again. We really appreciate y'all.